We just saw a great talk about a bunch of new techniques, and there's many more as we work our way up the aorta. Ali?
Thank you. So ascending aortic TEVAR, I think, is going to be more and more deployed in the near future, mostly for initially type A dissection and furthermore for additional complication of the reoperations, to avoid reoperations. These are my disclosures. So I think my other disclosure is that I'm an optimist, and I think, while majority of aortic operations are not amenable currently, as you see the picture from 2007, one of my patients had one of the first stent grafts in the ascending aorta. But many of them will be soon. In 2014, we did one of our first endo-wheat procedures, which is a TEVAR along with an ascending graft for patients who typically would need a cardiopulmonary bypass, circle arrest, and a wheat operation, which is an isolated AVR and ascending aortic graft. So if you look at, I really look at the classification of the aortic arch, and this is very critical because people say ascending TEVAR and mix up the different terms, but there are really 4 different types. There's the arch branch TEVAR, where it was our colleagues before talked about from Cleveland Clinic, Eric, as well as Nimesh, that has a tubular ascending landings on an ascending aorta. That's really the initial portion of it, but it's not really ascending through TEVAR. Then we have a tubular ascending TEVAR that really addresses ascending aortic pathologies. That's the first one. Next one is the endo-wheat, which I showed you the image, which is a valve plus a tubular ascending, all percutaneously deployed. And really, the holy grail is really endobental, which allows us really to treat a majority of pathologies of aortic roots. And we're talking that's about 70% of aortic pathologies that I see in practice includes valve, root, and tubular ascending aorta. And there are currently 4 IPs on it, and we have one of the IPs that we're excited about and we'll develop over the next few years. Now, this is one of the pictures that made me believe that this ascending really has a future. This patient is an 88-year-old female. You look at the access vessels, they're horrible. And she had a tamponade. You see an ascending aortic entry and right here with blood around the heart. This patient was intubated, had a brief coat, was intubated in ICU by my senior partner. I was out of town, and I was asked to evaluate this patient. On Monday, I come in, and this patient's got extubated and is neurologically intact, so we took her actually for an ascending transapical TEVAR. And you see we use an off-the-shelf ascending stent graft from Gore. And this patient is really 5 years out. The stent graft has enlarged because of her other pathologies, but she survived an acute event. And this patient otherwise, I would argue, was not a surgical candidate and was not a candidate for any other options. Typical equipment they use are imaging, which is typically in our case is a fixed imaging system, pressure injector, contrast obviously. We use IVUS, transcranial Doppler very commonly, MEP and SEPs, and regional oxygen saturations. Now, for patients who have significant calcification, we also use our embolic protection devices that are used for carotid as well. So, this is the transcranial Doppler that would allow us to look for any embolization as well and reduce the manipulation that we have in the aortic arch. Let's see if I can go back here and click on this. So if you look at the ascending, it's really much established just like a TEVAR. And we have imaging before and evaluate the access vessels. We look for transapical versus alternative options, including carotid options and subclavian. We have radial brachial carotid access where the angiographic imaging is performed. We use IVUS usually transfemorally, and the device is typically deployed in 90% plus in transfemorally as well. And we have heart-lung machine and standby available for this as well. We developed an IDE with Dr. White, which is the first really ascending stent graft that is FDA approved. The reason this is important in US is because this is the one that allows us for being able to use the data for future approval by the FDA, and none of those off-labels will allow that. Plus, there's also liability associated with this that an FDA approval will take away. And we're actually in process right now to spread it across the different centers in the US. This is a case that Dr. Bethencourt, I don't know if he's there, this is a case of Dr. Bethencourt who had multiple previous operations. It's not deemed to not be a surgical candidate. As you see, patient has a chronic dissection and comes in for endovascular repair, was not a surgical candidate. You see significant calcification in art. And this is an interesting case, and I want to show you the slides because everything doesn't go as smoothly as most presenters will show you. We did a transfemoral coronary angiogram, make sure the vessels are okay, and put a RV pacing lead in transphachially. And the first stent graft was subsequently deployed, which was a 46 by 46 by 8 centimeter specific IDE configuration. And suddenly we get this image under RV pacing. Any idea what went wrong here? Look at the angiogram. So suddenly we have a significant aortic regurgitation on the root angiogram. And the anesthesiologist is ecstatic to say, he wakes up out of his sleep and says, wow, we have dropping hemodynamics. Now this patient has femoral access. I can switch him to the transfemoral access and go on pump. But you can imagine if you have a wide open aortic regurgitation, presumably from the stent graft manipulation to the aortic valve, you will perfuse and pressurize the entire LV and will probably not help for patient's LV recovery subsequently. So in this case, I actually put a balloon in, and you don't have to pull on that balloon, but you inflate it large enough for the cardiac output to push that balloon back. And within literally a minute or so, we have this image suddenly. The stent graft has come back just enough not to involve the aortic valve. As you see, these cases when you have the stent graft very close to the aortic valve, despite your best RV pacing maneuvers, there is a possibility of that stent, in this case the bare stent, involving the aortic valve. Now the second stent graft was subsequently deployed to cover a distal landing zone. And you see the pigtail, for example, in this case coming from the innominate artery for the angiogram, and showing that there's complete opening of the innominate artery. And this is one of our patients. In conclusion, I want to say the proof of concept for TEVAR for ascending aorta is there. We have the first FDA-approved TEVARs with promising early results. We have done 14 patients entered, and about 48 patients that are part of them are off-label. But within the FDA-approved TEVAR, we have 14 patients entered, and we look forward to disseminate this across other centers. There's still many technical challenges to be tackled, specifically the coaxiality of the stent graft in ascending aorta, and I think the total endovascular solution will be the future. Thank you.